On my daughter's 32nd birthday, my son-in-law said to the waiter, pointing at me, "That old janitor, he's with me. Just ignore him." My daughter laughed, ashamed of me. They had no idea I owned the restaurant. That same day, I decided to disappear and leave a letter at their house. When they read about the 50 mm's inheritance, they screamed non-stop, "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you are watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. I've been invisible for so long that I almost forgot what it felt like to be seen." At 67 years old, standing in the corner of Romano's, watching my daughter Claire blow out 32 candles, I realized that somewhere along the way, I had become a ghost in my own family's life. The restaurant buzzed with laughter and conversation. Claire's friends surrounded her, their voices mixing with the soft jazz playing in the background. She looked beautiful in that emerald dress I'd never seen before, her hair styled perfectly, her smile radiant. For a moment, I felt that familiar surge of pride. My daughter, successful, confident, living the life I'd always dreamed she could have. Then James appeared at my elbow. "Excuse me," he said to the young waiter who'd been hovering nearby, unsure of where to seat me. "That old man is the janitor. He's with me. Just ignore him." The waiter's eyes darted between us, confusion flickering across his face. James's voice carried that particular tone he used when he wanted to sound important, the one that made my skin crawl. He placed a dismissive hand on my shoulder, guiding me away from the main table where Claire's friends were gathering. "Just find him a corner somewhere," James continued, his voice loud enough that several guests turned to look. "Preferably near the kitchen. He won't be staying long anyway." I felt the familiar tightness in my chest, that crushing sensation I'd grown accustomed to over the years. But what happened next was worse than James's cruelty. Claire looked up from her conversation, caught sight of the exchange and laughed. Not a nervous laugh, not an uncomfortable giggle. A genuine amused laugh, as if James had just told the funniest joke she'd heard all evening. "Oh, James, you're terrible," she said, but her eyes were sparkling with mirth. She glanced at me briefly, and I saw something that cut deeper than any insult James could hurl. Embarrassment. She was embarrassed by me. Her own father, the waiter young enough to be my grandson, guided me to a small table tucked behind a decorative pillar. It was the kind of table restaurants use for overflow, when they're desperate to squeeze in one more party. I could see everything but be seen by no one. The perfect spot for someone who didn't really belong. I sat down slowly, my knees protesting as they always did these days. Around me, the celebration continued. Claire's laugh rang out again, musical and carefree. James had his arm around her now, playing the perfect husband, the successful son-in-law, the man who'd rescued her from whatever disappointment I represented. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, sitting in Romano's, being treated like an intruder, when I could have bought and sold this place 10 times over. But they didn't know that. They'd never known that. A different waiter approached my table, younger than the first, with kind eyes and a gentle smile. "Can I get you something to drink, sir?" His politeness was a small comfort. "Just water, please," I said, my voice coming out rougher than I'd intended. As he walked away, I let my gaze wander around the dining room. Romano's was beautiful, I had to admit. The exposed brick walls, the warm lighting, the carefully curated vintage photographs. I remembered when this place was nothing but a run-down diner, before the renovations, before it became the trendy spot where people like James brought their wives to celebrate important occasions. I remembered a lot of things they didn't know about. From my hidden corner, I watched Claire open her gifts. Each present was met with squeals of delight, kisses for James, hugs for friends. Designer handbags, expensive jewelry, gift certificates to spas I knew she couldn't afford on her salary as a marketing coordinator. But James's family had money, or so everyone believed. James made sure everyone knew about his family's wealth, their status, their importance. What they didn't know was where that money actually came from. Dad. I looked up to find Claire standing beside my table. For a moment, hope fluttered in my chest. Maybe she'd come to apologize, to invite me to join the main celebration, to acknowledge that I belonged there too. "We're going to take some photos," she said, not quite meeting my eyes. "Would you mind just stepping outside for a few minutes? It's just that James's parents want some family shots and—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. I wasn't family. Not in the way that mattered. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. Of course. Standing up took more effort than it should have. My legs felt unsteady, but I made my way toward the exit, weaving between tables of happy diners who didn't spare me a second glance. Through the window I could see them gathering for photos, James positioning himself at the center, his arm possessively around Claire's waist. Outside, the October air was crisp against my face. I stood on the sidewalk, watching through the glass as they laughed and posed and celebrated a life I had no part in. A group of teenagers passed by, and one of them bumped into me without apology. To them, I was just another invisible old man taking up space on their sidewalk. That's when it hit me, standing there in the cold, watching my daughter's party through a window like some kind of beggar. I had spent 30 years making myself small, making myself convenient, making myself forgettable. And somewhere along the way I had succeeded beyond my wildest dreams. Claire didn't see me as her father anymore. She saw me as an obligation, an embarrassment, a reminder of a life she'd moved beyond. And James saw me as nothing at all, but they had no idea who they were really looking at. The waiter from inside appeared at the door, holding my jacket. "Sir, you left this." I took it from him, noticing the way his eyes lingered on my face with something that might have been sympathy. "Thank you." "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. I almost laughed. Was I all right? I was a man who'd spent 3 decades building an empire while letting his own daughter believe he was a failure. I was a father who had sacrificed everything for a child who now treated him like hired help. I was a ghost haunting his own life. "I'm fine," I told the young man. "Just fine." But as I walked away from Romano's, leaving behind the sounds of my daughter's celebration, I knew that something fundamental had shifted inside me. For years I told myself that their treatment of me didn't matter, that love didn't require recognition or respect. I'd convinced myself that being small was the same as being humble, that invisibility was just another form of sacrifice. I'd been wrong about everything. The drive home was quiet, my old Honda humming along streets I'd traveled for decades. When I pulled into the driveway of my modest ranch house, I sat for a moment in the darkness, listening to the engine tick as it cooled. Tomorrow, I decided, things were going to change. Tomorrow I was going to disappear. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Claire's face, the way she'd laughed when James called me the janitor. So I got up, made coffee, and found myself standing in front of the old photo albums I kept in the living room bookshelf. My fingers traced the worn cover of the first album. Inside, yellowed photographs chronicled a different time, a different Claire. There she was at age 5, gap-toothed and grinning, wearing the princess costume I'd sewn myself because we couldn't afford the one she'd seen in the store. She'd worn it for 3 months straight, even to grocery shopping, declaring that princesses needed to know how to pick the best apples. I turned the page. Claire at 7, standing beside her first bicycle, a second-hand pink Schwinn I'd spent 2 weeks restoring in the garage. She'd been so proud of that bike, riding it up and down our street for hours, shouting for me to watch every wobbly turn. The training wheels had come off after just 3 days because she was determined to be a big girl cyclist. The memories flooded back, each photograph a doorway to a time when I was her hero instead of her embarrassment. After Margaret died, when Claire was only 8 years old, everything changed. Cancer took my wife so quickly that we barely had time to understand what was happening. One day Margaret was planning Claire's 9th birthday party. The next day I was standing in a funeral home trying to figure out how to be both mother and father to a little girl whose world had just collapsed. Those first years were the hardest of my life. I remember the morning Claire woke up crying because she'd forgotten what her mother's voice sounded like. I held her for hours, humming the lullabies Margaret used to sing, feeling like the world's most inadequate substitute. But we survived. More than survived, we thrived. I worked 3 jobs to make ends meet. Days at the construction company, evenings doing bookkeeping for small businesses, weekends cleaning offices. Every dollar went toward Claire's future. Dance lessons when she was 10 because she'd seen a ballet on television and declared she wanted to fly like the pretty ladies. Piano lessons at 12 when she decided she was going to be the next Mozart. Art supplies, sports equipment, tutoring when math got difficult in high school. I never said no to anything that would help her grow, help her succeed, help her become the woman her mother would have been proud of. The college years nearly broke me financially. But I'd made a promise to Margaret on her deathbed that Claire would get the education we'd never had. State University wasn't good enough. Claire had her heart set on Northwestern. The tuition alone was more than I made in a year, but I found a way. I sold Margaret's engagement ring, the one thing I'd wanted to keep forever. I took out loans that would follow me well into retirement. I picked up a fourth job delivering newspapers at 4 in the morning. Claire never knew about any of it. As far as she was concerned, college was just something that happened, something she deserved, something that appeared magically when she needed it. I flipped through more photos. Claire's graduation, radiant in her cap and gown, holding her diploma in marketing. I was so proud I could barely contain myself, but when I tried to hug her afterward, she pulled away slightly, conscious of her appearance, worried about wrinkled clothes and smudged makeup. Her sorority sisters were taking pictures, and I didn't fit the image she wanted to project. Even then, I should have seen the signs. Then came James. I met him for the first time at Claire's graduation dinner. He was everything I wasn't. Polished, confident, well-dressed, well-spoken. He worked in finance, drove a BMW, lived in a downtown apartment with a view. When he shook my hand, his grip was firm, but his eyes looked right through me, already calculating whether I was worth his attention. The answer was clearly no. Within 6 months, Claire was spending more time at James's apartment than at home. When she did visit, she'd walk through our modest house with new eyes, seeing it the way James must see it. Outdated furniture, worn carpets, the kind of place successful people left behind. "Dad," she said one evening, about a year before their engagement, "maybe you should think about updating this place. It's just so dated." She was trying to be kind, but the message was clear. I was an embarrassment to the life she was building with James. I started working extra hours, not because I needed the money anymore. I'd been more successful than either of them realized, but because being home reminded me of how far apart we'd grown. Claire would call occasionally, usually when she needed something, help with a car payment when she'd overspent on clothes, assistance with her security deposit when she moved in with James, money for the engagement ring James had picked out, a 3-carat diamond that cost more than most people's cars. Each time I said yes. Each time I told myself this was what love looked like, being there when needed, asking no questions, expecting nothing in return. The wedding was the beginning of the end. James's family paid for most of it, making sure everyone knew about their generosity. But there were dozens of smaller expenses that somehow fell to me. Claire's dress alterations, the flowers for her hair, the special transportation she wanted for the bridesmaids. I covered it all quietly, invisibly, the way I'd learned to do everything. At the reception, I was seated at a table in the back with distant relatives and family friends James barely knew. Claire's table, the head table, might as well have been on another planet. During the father-daughter dance, she seemed distracted, her eyes scanning the room to see who was watching, who was taking pictures, whether she looked perfect enough for the photographers James had insisted on hiring. When the dance ended, she kissed my cheek quickly and whispered, "Thanks for everything, Dad." But her attention was already moving to the next moment, the next photo opportunity, the next step in the life she was building with James. That was 3 years ago, and in those 3 years I'd become increasingly invisible. Holiday dinners where I sat quietly while James dominated the conversation. Birthday celebrations where I was an afterthought. Grandchildren I barely saw because James's schedule didn't include inconvenient visits to his wife's embarrassing father. But what hurt most was watching Claire disappear into the person James wanted her to be. The spontaneous creative girl who'd once spent entire afternoons making elaborate drawings for me was gone. In her place was someone careful, someone who measured every word and gesture, someone who'd learned to see the world through James's eyes. And in James's eyes, I was nothing. I closed the photo album and sat back in my recliner, the one Claire always suggested I should replace with something more modern. The house around me was quiet, filled with 40 years of memories that apparently meant nothing to the one person whose opinion mattered most to me. That's when I made the decision that would change everything. For 30 years, I'd protected Claire from the truth about our financial situation. I'd lived modestly, worked constantly, and let her believe that everything we had was the result of my small construction job and careful budgeting. I'd wanted her to understand the value of hard work, the importance of humility, the satisfaction of earning what you had. Instead, she'd learned to be ashamed of me. But there were things about Frank Morrison that neither Claire nor James knew. There were investments, properties, business ventures that I'd kept carefully hidden. There was a portfolio that had grown steadily over the decades, fueled not just by careful saving but by some very smart decisions made during the tech boom of the 90s. There was also Romano's. I owned it. Had for 15 years, since the previous owner couldn't make his loan payments, and I'd quietly stepped in. Just like I owned 3 other restaurants in the city, 2 apartment buildings, and a small chain of dry cleaners that generated steady income month after month. Claire and James had no idea they'd been celebrating her birthday in a restaurant I could have closed with a phone call. Tomorrow I was going to start the process of disappearing from their lives. Not dramatically, not with anger or demands or ultimatums. I was simply going to fade away, the way they'd already made me feel invisible. But first I was going to write a letter that would explain everything they'd never bothered to learn about the man they dismissed as an embarrassing old janitor. And then I was going to leave them a gift, the knowledge of exactly what they'd lost. The next morning I drove to Romano's before they opened. I had a key, of course, though Claire and James would never have imagined such a thing. I let myself in through the back entrance, breathing in the familiar scent of fresh bread and coffee that always lingered in the air. Mario, the head chef, looked up from his prep station with surprise. "Mr. Morrison, everything okay? We don't open for another 2 hours." "Everything's fine, Mario," I said, hanging my jacket on the hook by the office door. "Just needed to take care of some paperwork." Mario had been with Romano's for 8 years, since shortly after I'd bought the place. He was one of the few people who knew the truth about my ownership, though I'd sworn him to secrecy years ago. In his late 50s, with calloused hands and a gentle smile, Mario understood the value of discretion. "How was the party last night?" he asked, returning to his chopping. "Your daughter looked beautiful." I paused in the doorway to my office. "She did. Thank you for making everything perfect." What Mario didn't know was that I'd specifically requested he prepare Claire's favorite dishes without her ever knowing I'd had a hand in the menu. The lobster ravioli she'd raved about, the tiramisu that had made her close her eyes in bliss, the wine pairing that James had complimented loudly. All of it had been my gift to her, invisible and unacknowledged. In my office, I sat behind the desk that most people assumed belonged to the manager. The real manager, Sandra, was excellent at running the day-to-day operations. But the major decisions, the financial planning, the strategic direction, all of that came from me. I opened the safe hidden behind the motivational poster that everyone probably thought was purely decorative. Inside were documents that told the real story of Frank Morrison's life. Documents that would have shocked my daughter and her husband into speechlessness. The Romano's purchase agreement from 15 years ago, $14,800,000 paid in cash. The deed to Antonelli's, the Italian place across town, $12 million, purchased 3 years ago when the owner's son ran it into the ground. The ownership papers for the greenhouse, the trendy farm-to-table restaurant that James had mentioned wanting to try someday. $18 million, my most recent acquisition. Property deeds for 2 apartment complexes on the east side of town, generating over $40,000 a month in rental income. And then there were the investment portfolios. 3 different brokerage accounts that Claire had never known existed, each one carefully managed and steadily growing for the past 3 decades. The tech stocks I'd bought in the early 90s before anyone understood what the internet would become. The real estate investment trusts that had been paying dividends for 20 years. The municipal bonds that provided steady, reliable income. The total value fluctuated with the market, but as of last month's statement, my net worth was just over $52 million. $52 million that my daughter had never suspected, accumulated by the man she thought cleaned buildings for a living. The irony was almost funny. James had spent 3 years looking down on me, treating me like some embarrassing charity case, never knowing that I could have bought his family's business twice over without feeling the dent. I'd worked construction for 25 years, that much was true, but I'd also been investing every spare dollar, learning about markets and opportunities and the magic of compound interest. When the construction company I worked for went up for sale, I'd bought it. When the company next door was struggling with cash flow, I'd bought that too. By the time I retired, I owned 7 small companies across 3 states. But I'd never told Claire any of it. At first it was because I wanted her to value hard work over easy money. I'd seen too many kids ruined by knowing their parents were wealthy, developing a sense of entitlement that poisoned everything they touched. I wanted Claire to earn her own way, to understand that success came from effort and determination, not from accident of birth. As she got older, the reason evolved. I saw how she looked at wealth, how she was attracted to James partly because of his family's money, how she seemed to believe that financial success was the ultimate measure of a person's worth. I didn't want her to love me because I was rich. I wanted her to love me because I was her father. But somewhere along the way, she'd stopped loving me at all. I pulled out a legal pad and began writing the letter I'd been composing in my mind all night. The words came slowly at first, then faster as the emotions I'd been suppressing for years finally found their voice. "My dear Claire," I wrote, "by the time you read this, I will be gone." I paused, staring at those words. Gone. It sounded so final, so dramatic, but it was accurate. The Frank Morrison who had spent 30 years accepting disrespect and invisibility would be gone. What remained would be something different, someone different. I want you to know that every choice I made in my life was motivated by love for you. When your mother died, I promised her that you would have every opportunity, every advantage, every chance to succeed that we could provide. I kept that promise, though not in the way you might have expected. I wrote about the sacrifices, the extra jobs, the careful investments. I wrote about the businesses I'd built and the properties I'd acquired, all with the intention of leaving her a legacy that would ensure she never wanted for anything. I know you must wonder why I never told you about any of this. The answer is both simple and complicated. I wanted you to be proud of who you were, not what you had. I wanted you to value character over cash, effort over inheritance. I wanted you to become the kind of person who would treat a janitor with the same respect you'd show a CEO, because human worth isn't measured by bank statements. My hand was shaking as I wrote the next part. Last night at Romano's, I watched you laugh when James called me a janitor. You were embarrassed by me, ashamed to claim me as your father in front of your friends. What you didn't know was that Romano's is my restaurant. I own it just as I own 3 others in this city. The meal you enjoyed, the service you received, the ambience you complimented. All of it was provided by the man you were too ashamed to acknowledge. I set the pen down and walked to the window that looked out over the main dining room. Soon the lunch crowd would begin arriving, filling the tables with conversations and laughter and the comfortable noise of people enjoying themselves. None of them would know that the quiet old man who occasionally sat in the corner booth was the reason this place existed. I picked up the pen again. I have spent 30 years making myself invisible, telling myself that love didn't require recognition or respect. I was wrong. Love requires honesty, and I have not been honest with you. By hiding my success, I allowed you to create a version of me that bore no resemblance to reality. By accepting your disrespect, I enabled you to become someone I no longer recognize. The hardest part came next. I'm leaving you the inheritance your mother and I always planned for you. $50 million, held in trust, will be yours when you turn 40. That gives you 8 years to decide what kind of person you want to be. The money comes with no strings attached, no conditions, no requirements. It is yours because I love you, not because you deserve it. I stopped writing for a moment, overwhelmed by the finality of what I was doing. Once this letter was delivered, there would be no going back. No more awkward family dinners where I sat quietly while James dominated the conversation. No more birthday parties where I was relegated to the corner like an unwanted guest. No more hoping that someday, somehow my daughter would see me again. I will not be returning to this life, I continued. The Frank Morrison who accepted disrespect because he was afraid of losing you is gone. I have purchased a house in Oregon, near the coast, where I will spend whatever years remain to me in peace. You can reach me through my attorney if there are legal matters that require my attention, but I will not be available for the kind of relationship we have had. The last paragraph was the most difficult of all. I hope that someday, when the shock of this revelation fades, you will understand that everything I did was an act of love. I hope you will remember the father who taught you to ride a bicycle and helped with your homework and held you when you had nightmares. I hope you will forgive me for the deception, even if you cannot forgive me for the departure. And I hope that when you look in the mirror, you will see not just the woman James wants you to be, but the remarkable person your mother and I raised you to become. I signed it simply, with love always dead. Then I sealed it in an envelope and wrote Claire's address on the front. Tomorrow, after I was already gone, she would find this letter in her mailbox. By the time she finished reading it, the man she thought she knew would have vanished, leaving behind only the truth she'd never bothered to discover. I locked the letter in the safe along with the other documents. Tomorrow I would give it to Mario with instructions to deliver it after I'd left town. For now I had other preparations to make, starting with a phone call to the most expensive law firm in the city. 3 days later, I sat in the mahogany-paneled office of Harrison, Pike & Associates, the kind of law firm that charged $800 an hour and earned every penny. Across from me, Victoria Harrison reviewed the documents I'd brought with methodical precision, her silver hair gleaming under the soft office lighting. "Mr. Morrison," she said, looking up from the trust paperwork, "I have to ask, are you certain about these arrangements? Once implemented, they'll be very difficult to modify." I leaned back in the leather chair that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. "I'm certain." Victoria had been recommended by my financial advisor, a man who'd been managing my investments for 15 years without ever meeting my daughter. He described Victoria as discreet, brilliant, and completely without sentiment. Exactly what I'd needed for what came next. "The trust is straightforward enough," she continued, flipping through pages. $50 million held until Claire Morrison Whitfield reaches age 40, with interim distributions for education, medical emergencies, and housing if she meets certain criteria. But this other provision. She paused, tapping a paragraph with her pen. "You're essentially cutting off all current financial support immediately." "That's correct." What Victoria didn't know, what no one knew except me, was the extent of the support I'd been providing. For the past 3 years, since Claire married James, I'd been quietly covering expenses they thought were handled by James's trust fund. The mortgage on their house in the affluent Westwood neighborhood, $2,800 a month, paid from one of my shell companies. Claire's car payment, $450 monthly for the BMW James had insisted she needed. The insurance, the utilities, the country club membership that James claimed his father paid for. James's father had been dead for 2 years. It had been surprisingly easy to maintain the deception. James was arrogant enough to assume his family's wealth was inexhaustible, and Claire was trusting enough to believe whatever he told her about their finances. Neither of them had ever looked too closely at where the money actually came from. "There's also the matter of your businesses," Victoria continued. "You're transferring ownership of 4 restaurants to a management company, but retaining ultimate control through a complex trust structure. Why not simply sell them?" "Because they represent 30 years of work," I said. "I built them not just for profit, but to create jobs, to serve good food, to be part of the community. I won't sell them to someone who might destroy what I've created." The truth was more complicated than that. Romano's held too many memories, too many connections to Claire's childhood and my life with Margaret. Even after everything that had happened, I wasn't ready to let strangers own the place where I'd celebrated Claire's every birthday until she'd moved in with James. "And the house in Oregon?" "Paid for in cash. I close on it next week. I'd found the property 3 months ago, though I hadn't known then that I'd actually be using it. A small cottage on the coast near Cannon Beach, with a view of the Pacific and enough privacy that I could disappear completely if I chose to. It was nothing like the grand mansion I could have afforded, but it was perfect for a man who'd spent decades learning that happiness had nothing to do with the size of your house." Victoria made notes on her legal pad, her expression neutral. "When do you want to implement these changes?" "Immediately. I'll be leaving town tomorrow morning." "And your daughter has no idea about any of this?" "None." Victoria set down her pen and studied me with the kind of direct gaze that probably intimidated opposing counsel. "Mr. Morrison, in 30 years of practice, I've seen a lot of family situations that ended badly. Are you sure this is the resolution you want? Once you disappear, there's no guarantee you'll be able to repair the relationship later." I thought about that question as I looked out the window at the city I'd lived in for 47 years. Below, people hurried along sidewalks, living their lives, pursuing their dreams, taking for granted the connections they had with the people who mattered most to them. "The relationship is already broken," I said finally. "This isn't about punishment. It's about truth." Victoria nodded and returned to her papers. "Very well. I'll have everything finalized by this afternoon. The letter you wrote will be delivered exactly as you specified, 48 hours after you've left town." That evening I stood in my living room, surrounded by boxes and the accumulated possessions of a lifetime. Most of it would go to charity. I was only taking clothes, a few photographs, and the small wooden box where Margaret had kept her jewelry. Everything else represented the life I was leaving behind. I'd already spoken to Sandra, the manager at Romano's, though I hadn't told her everything. As far as she knew, I was taking an extended vacation and would be managing my interests remotely. Mario knew more of the truth, but he'd sworn to keep my secrets as he always had. The hardest part had been calling my neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, who'd been keeping an eye on my house for years. I told her I was moving to be closer to family in Oregon, a lie that came easier than the truth. She promised to forward any mail and wished me well with tears in her eyes. "You're such a good father, Frank," she'd said. "Claire is so lucky to have you." If only she knew. My phone had been silent for 3 days. No calls from Claire, no texts asking about dinner plans or whether I could help with some household project. It was as if I'd already disappeared from their lives, which made my actual departure feel like a formality. I'd left one final surprise for them, something they'd discover gradually over the coming weeks. The utilities that I'd been paying for their house would be shut off when the automated payments stopped. The mortgage company would start sending notices when the transfers from my account ceased. The credit card James used for his business lunches, the one he thought was connected to his family's wealth, would be declined the next time he tried to use it. But the cruelest revelation would come when they tried to book their planned vacation to Europe next month. The travel agent would inform them that the trust account they'd been using for luxury trips had been closed. The balance transferred to an account they couldn't access. Slowly, systematically, they would discover that their comfortable life had been built on money that came from the man they treated like an embarrassing relative. At 10 o'clock that night, I loaded the last box into my Honda and took one final walk through the house. In the kitchen, I passed the table where I'd helped Claire with her homework every night for 10 years. In the living room, I stopped in front of the mantel where photos of her childhood still stood, untouched by James's efforts to modernize our space. The house felt hollow now, empty of the dreams and hopes I'd invested in it. But it also felt peaceful, like a burden I'd been carrying had finally been set down. I drove slowly through the streets of my neighborhood, past houses where neighbors slept peacefully, unaware that one of them was disappearing forever. At Romano's, I stopped to leave Mario the envelope containing Claire's letter, along with instructions for its delivery. "You sure about this, Mr. Morrison?" Mario asked, accepting the envelope with obvious reluctance. "I'm sure. She's going to be hurt." "She's been hurting me for years," I replied. The difference is I don't think she ever noticed. By dawn, I was on Interstate 84, heading west toward a new life. In the rearview mirror, the city grew smaller until it disappeared entirely, taking with it 47 years of history, 30 years of single parenthood, and 3 years of slowly learning that love without respect was just another form of suffering. My phone, lying silent on the passenger seat, would remain off until I reached Oregon. By then, Claire would have found my letter. By then, the shock would be setting in, and by then, I would be too far away to change my mind about any of it. The highway stretched ahead, empty and full of possibilities, leading toward a coast I'd never seen and a life I'd never imagined needing. Behind me, in a house in Westwood, 2 people were about to discover exactly what they'd lost when they decided that Frank Morrison didn't matter enough to treat with basic human dignity. I hoped the lesson would be worth the cost. Claire Morrison Whitfield stood in her driveway, staring at the envelope in her hands. Her name was written across the front in her father's careful handwriting, the same script that had signed countless report cards and birthday cards throughout her childhood. But something about this envelope felt different, ominous. It had been 2 days since anyone had seen Frank. She tried calling him 3 times yesterday, but the calls went straight to voicemail. When she'd driven by his house that morning, it looked empty, his car gone from the driveway. Mrs. Patterson, his elderly neighbor, had mentioned something about him moving to Oregon, but that was impossible. Her father didn't make major life decisions without consulting her. Did he? Inside the house, James was on a work call in his deep office, his voice carrying that sharp tone he used with subordinates. Claire set her purse on the kitchen counter, still holding the envelope. Part of her wanted to wait for James before opening it, but something held her back. This felt private, personal, meant for her alone. She tore open the envelope carefully and unfolded 3 pages of her father's neat handwriting. The first line made her sink onto one of the bar stools. "My dear Claire, by the time you read this, I will be gone." Her hands trembled as she continued reading. The words seemed to blur together at first, too shocking to comprehend. Her father writing about promises made to her dying mother, about sacrifices she'd never known about businesses and investments and a fortune that couldn't possibly exist. "Last night at Romano's, I watched you laugh when James called me a janitor. You were embarrassed by me, ashamed to claim me as your father in front of your friends. What you didn't know was that Romano's is my restaurant." Claire's breath caught in her throat. She read the sentence again, certain she'd misunderstood. Romano's belonged to her father. The elegant restaurant where they'd celebrated her birthday, where James had boasted about the wine selection, where she'd complimented the ambience while relegating her father to a corner table. The letter continued, each revelation more stunning than the last. Her father owned not just Romano's, but 3 other restaurants. He had investments worth millions. The modest construction worker she'd grown up with was worth $50 million. $50 million. The pages slipped from her numb fingers, scattering across the granite countertop. Through the kitchen window, she could see their perfectly manicured lawn, the BMW in the driveway, the life she'd taken for granted. A life that, according to this letter, had been built on money from the man she treated like an embarrassment. "Claire, what's wrong?" James appeared in the doorway, having finished his call. He looked polished as always, his tie perfectly knotted, his hair styled with expensive product. Everything about him screamed success, importance, wealth. But whose wealth? "My father is gone," she whispered, the words feeling strange in her mouth. "He left this letter." James frowned, moving closer. "Gone where? What kind of letter?" She gestured weakly at the scattered pages. James gathered them up, his expression shifting from concern to confusion to something that looked like panic as he read. "This can't be right," he said, his voice tight. "Your father doesn't have this kind of money. He lives in that tiny house, drives that piece of junk car. He's just a retired construction worker." Claire picked up the first page again, rereading the part about Romano's. "He says he owns the restaurant, the one where we had my birthday dinner." "That's impossible." But James's voice lacked conviction. She watched his face as he continued reading, saw the moment when reality began to sink in. "Claire, if this is true..." "If it's true, then we've been living on his money." The words came out flat, emotionless. She felt disconnected from her own voice, as if she were watching someone else's life implode. The house, the cars, the vacations, all of it. James was quiet for a long moment, his face pale. Then he pulled out his phone and dialed a number. "I need to speak with Mr. Bradford," he said when someone answered. "It's urgent." Claire knew that name. Bradford was James's financial advisor, the man who supposedly managed his family trust. She listened as James explained the situation, his voice growing more strained with each word. "What do you mean the account is closed?" James demanded. "Since when? Why wasn't I notified?" Claire felt something cold settle in her stomach. She walked to the window, staring out at their neighborhood without really seeing it. Behind her, James's conversation grew more heated. "I don't understand," he was saying. "The payments were automatic. They've been coming from that account for 3 years. When he hung up, the silence in the kitchen was deafening. "The trust account is empty," James said quietly. "It was closed 2 days ago. Bradford says all the automatic payments have been stopped." Claire turned to face him. "What automatic payments?" James ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, destroying the careful arrangement. "The mortgage, the car payments, the credit cards. Everything was set up to draw from what I thought was my family's account. But it wasn't. No, apparently it was some kind of shell company. Bradford doesn't know who was funding it, but whoever it was pulled the plug." They stood there staring at each other, the truth settling between them like a physical presence. Claire's father, the man they dismissed and humiliated, had been supporting their entire lifestyle. Every comfort, every luxury, every symbol of their success had been paid for by the man James had called a janitor. "Oh God," Claire whispered, sinking back onto the bar stool. "What have we done?" The next few hours passed in a blur of phone calls and mounting panic. The mortgage company confirmed that the automatic payments had stopped. The credit card companies were already sending notices about declined transactions. The country club membership that James had claimed was a family legacy was about to be suspended for non-payment. Piece by piece, their life began to unravel. "We have to find him," James said for the 10th time, pacing the living room like a caged animal. "We have to explain, make him understand that we didn't know." But Claire was remembering things. Her father's quiet presence at family gatherings, the way he'd accepted their dismissive treatment without complaint, the times he'd offered to help with expenses and James had turned him down with barely concealed disdain, the birthday dinner where they'd treated him like an unwanted guest in a restaurant he apparently owned. "We did know," she said quietly. "What?" "We knew we were treating him badly. We knew we were being cruel. We just didn't care because we thought he didn't matter." James stopped pacing. "Claire, that's not fair. We thought he was just a poor old man who needed our charity." "No," she said, her voice stronger now. "We thought he was an embarrassment. We thought he was beneath us. And when he tried to be part of our lives, we pushed him away because he didn't fit the image we wanted to project." The full weight of her father's letter was beginning to sink in. Not just the financial revelations, but the emotional truth beneath them. He had spent 30 years sacrificing for her, building a fortune to secure her future, all while accepting treatment that would have sent most people running, and she had driven him away. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. The caller ID showed her father's number, and she grabbed it desperately. Dad, where are you?" But it wasn't her father's voice that answered. "Miss Whitfield, this is Victoria Harrison from Harrison, Pike and Associates. I'm your father's attorney." Claire's heart sank. "Is he okay? Where is he?" "Mr. Morrison is fine," the lawyer said in a crisp, professional tone. "I'm calling to inform you that certain financial arrangements are being modified. You should be receiving documentation in the next few days. I need to talk to him. I need to explain. Mr. Morrison has made it clear that he doesn't wish to have contact with you at this time," the lawyer interrupted. "However, he wants you to know that his love for you remains unchanged, even if his ability to continue enabling your current lifestyle does not." The line went dead. Claire sat in the sudden silence, the phone still pressed to her ear. Around her, the house that had always felt like home now seemed foreign, temporary. Every piece of furniture, every carefully chosen decoration, every symbol of their prosperity felt like a lie. James was standing by the window, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "The BMW is being repossessed tomorrow," he said without turning around. "I just got the call." Claire looked down at the letter again, reading the part about the $50 million inheritance waiting for her when she turned 40. Money that would be hers in 8 years, if she could figure out how to become the person her father had hoped she would be. But right now that seemed impossible. Right now she couldn't even figure out how to pay next month's mortgage, or how to live with the knowledge that she had thrown away the most important relationship in her life for the sake of appearances, for the approval of people who didn't really matter, for a version of herself that she was no longer sure she recognized. Outside, a car pulled into their driveway. Through the window, Claire could see a tow truck preparing to take away the BMW that had been a symbol of their success. Soon the symbols would all be gone. And then they would have to figure out who they really were underneath all the expensive pretenses. Claire picked up her father's letter one more time, focusing on the final paragraph. "I hope that when you look in the mirror you will see not just the woman James wants you to be, but the remarkable person your mother and I raised you to become." She couldn't remember the last time she'd looked in the mirror and seen that person, but maybe it wasn't too late to try. 6 months later, I stood on the deck of my cottage watching the Pacific Ocean stretch endlessly toward the horizon. The morning fog was just beginning to lift, revealing patches of grey-blue water that sparkled in the emerging sunlight. In my hands, a cup of coffee grew cold as I lost myself in the rhythmic sound of waves against the rocky coastline below. This was peace. The cottage was smaller than any house I'd lived in since Claire was born, but it was perfect. 2 bedrooms, one converted into an office where I could manage my business interest remotely. A kitchen with windows that faced the ocean. A living room with a fireplace that I used almost every evening, even in summer, because I'd learned that warmth was about more than temperature. I'd been sleeping through the night for the first time in years. My phone rang, interrupting the morning quiet. I almost didn't answer it, but the caller ID showed Victoria Harrison's office number. "Mr. Morrison?" Victoria's voice was careful, professional. "I have some information you should know about." I settled into one of the Adirondack chairs I'd positioned to catch the best view of the sunrise. "Go ahead. Your daughter has been trying to reach you through our office for the past 4 months. She's been quite persistent." This wasn't news. Victoria had been screening calls and letters since I'd arrived in Oregon, following my explicit instructions. I wasn't ready to hear Claire's apologies, her explanations, her promises to change. I'd heard too many empty promises over the years. "Has she said what she wants?" I asked. Victoria paused. "According to my assistant, she wants to apologize. She says she understands now what she lost, and she's asking for a chance to make things right." I took a sip of my coffee, watching a fishing boat move slowly across the horizon. "What about James?" "They're divorced. Has been for 3 months now, apparently. She says it was her decision." That surprised me. I'd expected James to leave once the money dried up, but I hadn't anticipated Claire finding the strength to end it herself. "There's more," Victoria continued. "She's moved back into your old house. She's been maintaining it, paying the property taxes, keeping everything exactly as you left it. She says she's hoping you'll come home someday." I closed my eyes, feeling something twist in my chest. The house where I'd raised her, where Margaret and I had planned our future, where Claire had taken her first steps and spoken her first words. She was living there now, in the rooms where I'd been happiest and most heartbroken. "Mr. Morrison, are you still there?" "I'm here," I said quietly. "She also wanted me to tell you that she's been volunteering at a shelter for homeless families. 3 days a week. She says you would have approved." I opened my eyes, looking out at the ocean again. The fog had lifted completely now, revealing a clear view all the way to the horizon. Somewhere out there, beyond what I could see, was the life I'd left behind. The daughter I'd raised and lost, and perhaps, just perhaps, might know again someday. "Victoria," I said finally, "I want you to send Claire a message." "Of course." "Tell her I'm proud that she chose herself over the life James wanted for her. Tell her I hope she finds happiness, whatever that looks like for her. But also tell her that I'm not ready to come back yet." Victoria made notes on her end of the line. "Is there anything else?" I thought about that question as I watched the waves roll in and out with their ancient rhythm. Was there anything else? After 30 years of putting Claire's needs before my own, after decades of making myself smaller to make her life easier, after sacrificing my own identity to be the father I thought she needed. "Yes," I said. "Tell her that when she's ready to know Frank Morrison the man, not just Frank Morrison the father, she can come to Oregon. But if she comes, it won't be to apologize. It will be to start something new." After I hung up, I remained on the deck for a long time, thinking about the difference between forgiveness and reconciliation. I had forgiven Claire months ago, not because she deserved it, but because holding on to anger was exhausting. But forgiveness didn't mean going back to the way things were. It meant being willing to see if something better was possible. 3 weeks later, on a Thursday morning that started like any other, I heard a car pull up outside my cottage. I wasn't expecting anyone, and my nearest neighbor was almost a mile away. I set down the book I'd been reading and walked to the front window. A rental car sat in my driveway. As I watched, the driver's door opened and Claire stepped out. She looked different. Thinner, more serious, wearing jeans and a simple sweater instead of the designer clothes James had insisted on. Her hair was longer, pulled back in a ponytail that made her look younger. She stood beside the car for a moment, staring at my cottage with an expression I couldn't read from this distance. I opened the front door before she could knock. "Hello, Dad." "Hello, Claire." We looked at each other across the threshold, 30 years of history and 6 months of silence hanging between us. She was my daughter, the little girl I'd pushed on swings and helped with homework and loved more than my own life. She was also a stranger, a woman who'd chosen a husband over her, father and money over character. But looking at her now, I saw something I hadn't seen in years. The person Margaret and I had raised her to be. "I know you said not to come here to apologize," she said quietly. "But I need you to know that I understand what I did. I understand what I lost. And I understand that saying I'm sorry isn't enough to fix it." I stepped back, holding the door open. "Would you like some coffee?" She nodded and followed me into the small kitchen. As I poured 2 cups, she looked around the cottage with curiosity rather than judgment. Through the window, the ocean sparkled in the afternoon light. "It's beautiful here," she said. "It is." We sat at my kitchen table, the same one where I'd helped her with algebra homework 20 years ago. I'd brought it with me to Oregon, one of the few pieces of furniture I couldn't leave behind. "I read your letter about 100 times," Claire said, wrapping her hands around her coffee mug. "Every word of it. And I kept coming back to the part where you said I'd become someone you didn't recognize." I waited, not sure where this was heading. "You were right," she continued. "I had become someone I didn't recognize either. Someone who cared more about appearances than people. Someone who let a man convince me that my father wasn't good enough for the life I wanted to live." She paused, staring into her coffee. "James left 2 days after the money stopped. He said he couldn't live with someone who'd been so stupid about their own family's finances. As if I was the one who'd been lying about where the money came from." "I'm sorry," I said, meaning it. Claire shook her head. "Don't be. It was the best thing that could have happened. It forced me to see who he really was and who I'd become because of him." We talked for 3 hours. About the divorce, about her volunteer work at the shelter, about the house where she was living alone for the first time in her life. About how she'd been learning to cook, something she'd never bothered with when she'd had money for restaurants every night. About the book club she'd joined at the local library and how different it was from the social groups James had insisted they join. She didn't ask about coming home. She didn't beg for forgiveness or make promises about changing. She just talked and I listened, and slowly I began to see glimpses of the daughter I remembered. As the sun began to set, painting the ocean in shades of orange and pink, Claire stood up to leave. "Thank you for the coffee," she said. "And for listening. Thank you for coming." At the door she paused. "Dad, I know I don't have the right to ask this, but would it be okay if I came back sometime? Just to visit, to talk. I'm not asking you to forgive me or come home or fix anything. I'd like to know who Frank Morrison is when he's not trying to take care of everyone else." I looked at my daughter, really looked at her, and saw something I'd been hoping to see for years. Honesty. She wasn't here to get something from me. She was here to give something to me. Her time, her attention, her genuine interest in who I was as a person. "I'd like that," I said. She smiled then, the first real smile I'd seen from her since she was a teenager. "I'll call first next time." "You don't have to." After she drove away, I stood on my deck watching the last light fade from the sky. The ocean was calm, reflecting the first stars beginning to appear overhead. Somewhere behind me, the cottage waited with its comfortable furniture and peaceful rooms and the life I'd built for myself. For the first time since I'd left, I felt complete. Not because my daughter had come back into my life, though that was a gift I hadn't dared hope for, but because she had come back as herself, not as someone trying to get something from me. She had driven 8 hours to sit in my kitchen and drink coffee and ask nothing of me except my company. It was enough. More than enough. It was everything I'd never known I wanted. 6 months later, Claire called to tell me she was engaged. Not to James, who had apparently remarried his law school girlfriend within 3 months of their divorce. To David, a teacher she'd met at the volunteer program, someone who worked with inner-city kids and drove a 10-year-old Honda and had never heard of James's family. "I'd like you to meet him," she said over the phone. "Not because I need your approval, but because he's important to me and you're important to me, and I want the people I love to know each other." I flew back for the first time in a year. Not to move back, not to resume the life I'd left behind, but to meet the man my daughter loved and to see how she was building her new life. The wedding was small, held in the backyard of my old house with 25 people and flowers from Claire's own garden. She wore her mother's dress, altered to fit her smaller frame, and carried a bouquet of wildflowers that David had picked that morning. I walked her down the aisle, but this time I wasn't invisible. This time I was her father, standing beside a daughter who had chosen love over money, character over appearances, authenticity over the safety of other people's expectations. When the minister asked who gave this woman to be married, I said, "Her mother and I do, with joy and blessing." And I meant every word. The reception was potluck, with friends bringing homemade dishes and David's guitar-playing brother providing the music. Claire and I danced to "The Way You Look Tonight," the song Margaret and I had danced to at our own wedding 35 years ago. "Thank you," Claire whispered as we swayed to the music. "For what?" "For not giving up on me completely, for leaving the door open even when I didn't deserve it." I looked at my daughter, beautiful in her mother's dress, surrounded by people who loved her for who she really was. "You're my daughter," I said. The door was never really closed. 2 days later, I flew back to Oregon, to my cottage and my ocean and my peaceful life. But now it felt different, not like running away, but like coming home. Claire called every week, not because she felt obligated, but because she wanted to share her life with me. David sent pictures of the garden they were planting together. They visited for Christmas, bringing homemade gifts and stories and laughter that filled my small house with joy. I never moved